A name carries weight, you merely occupy space beneath it. My father laid a manila envelope across the dinner table and told me I should sign. Sign on this line, this one, and this one. The papers positioned my half of the family's bakery. The building I'd unlocked alone at 4:40 every morning for 6 years, as collateral against my brother's concealed debts. My brother sat across from me in complete silence. My mother folded her hands and offered a small nod as if he'd asked me to pass the butter instead of surrender everything I'd built alone. My father was smiling because he was certain I would sign. I always signed. I never questioned. I didn't let the emotion show. I kept my pen steady and set it down beside the papers with careful precision. The way you place something you intend to reclaim. They believed the meeting was merely procedure. They believed the building was partly theirs to mortgage, and partly mine to give away. What they didn't anticipate was the single question the title agent would ask aloud 6 weeks later in a conference room with walls of glass and my brother's lender present. That question would turn my father's smile inside out before lunchtime, because the deed to that building had held exactly one name for 6 years, and it wasn't the name he'd assumed. For now, imagine me capping my pen while everyone watched to see if I'd finally break. The storefront sits on Borough High Street, a narrow Victorian building constructed of red brick with a dark green awning. My grandmother painted herself the year she turned 70. Ground level houses the bakery. Ashford's, our family name in gold leaf against the window. 2 modest flats above. It has been the heart of our family for 30 years. For the last 6 of those years, I have been the one who opens it at 4:40 every morning. I adjust recipes. I manage the payroll. I lock the register at night and verify every transaction against our bank deposits. When the commercial oven's compressor failed in February, I was the one who called the engineer, and the one who paid the invoice. My parents enjoy saying the bakery is the family's heart. What they actually mean is that it's the family's income, and I am the hand that keeps it functioning. Let me walk you through a typical morning so you understand what they were prepared to mortgage without hesitation. 4:40. I unlock the back entrance. The ovens require an hour to reach temperature, so they're switched on first, before lights, before anything. I pull the proofing trays I'd prepared the previous evening. I weigh flour using a scale older than myself, brass and iron, something my grandmother purchased secondhand in 1992. By 5:30, the laminated dough is in the oven. By 6:00, the first regulars are tapping on the glass. A retired tube driver named Arthur, who orders the same plain croissant he's ordered for 9 years. A night shift nurse named Sarah, still in her uniform, carrying the smell of the hospital with her. They know my name. They tip the young counter staff, not me, because they assume I'm simply the owner's daughter helping out. That's what nobody in my family ever understood. The bakery isn't a building that generates income. It's 400 small decisions each day. Every single one mine, made before the world wakes up. My father visited perhaps twice yearly. He'd stand in the middle of the shop in his tailored blazer, surveying the queue out the door like a landlord assessing his property, and would say something like, "Decent crowd today. The Ashford name still carries weight." He'd take a coffee without paying and leave. My mother came even less frequently. When she did, it was to collect a cake for one of her charity functions, and she invariably expected it complimentary, and she consistently introduced me to her friends as helping with the family business. Helping, as if I were a volunteer. As if the operation ran itself and I simply happened to be standing nearby. My brother Oliver is 2 years my senior. He has never worked a single shift. He has, however, represented our family at numerous business lunches. Somewhere across those tables, he accumulated obligations that nobody at our dinner table would acknowledge directly. For much of my life, Oliver was more concept than person. The concept of who the Ashfords would become. There was always an opportunity he was nearly securing, a partner he was nearly meeting, a future perpetually one introduction away. My parents financed that future the way some people feed a slot machine, convinced the next pull would compensate for all the others. And each time the machine swallowed their money, The bill somehow shifted toward me. A family loan never repaid. Temporary rent coverage that extended 2 years. The Christmas my father quietly asked if the bakery could provide Oliver £8,000 for a venture that dissolved by April. I declined that request. It was the first time I'd said no to anything, and my mother didn't speak to me for 30 days, and I learned that in our family, the word no proved more costly when it originated from me. So when my father mentioned a remortgage, I already understood before anyone sat down that the number would belong to Oliver. The loan meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon at my parents' residence. The same dining table where my father announced every decision he'd already made. "It's merely a remortgage," he'd said. "We extract equity from the building. Oliver settles what he owes. The family remains intact." I asked, "Whose equity?" My mother looked at me as if I'd cursed in church. "The family's, Eleanor. Don't make this unpleasant." A manila folder rested beneath my father's arm. He didn't open it. I took note of it regardless. "You'll sign," he said. "Not a question." This is the element I didn't express aloud. I'd reviewed that building's paperwork more recently than he had, which explains why, when he pushed the envelope across, my hands remained steady. Before I continue, if this is causing tension, pause for a moment and like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this story reach others who've been the person their family leans on. And tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is right now. I read every single comment. Knowing how far this travels matters to me. I'm Eleanor. I'm 29, and what you're about to hear is the moment preceding a question I'd been waiting 6 years for someone to ask directly. So, back to that table. To understand why my father could say, "You merely occupy space under it," you need to understand the accounting my family had employed with me from childhood. When I was 9, Oliver broke a neighbor's window with a cricket ball. I was upstairs completing homework. My father grounded me for not supervising him. That was the year I learned my perspective carried no weight in that house. That's the complete flashback. I won't guide you through my entire childhood because the pattern was consistent. Only the figures changed. Oliver was the name. I was the machinery. What shifted was my grandmother, Vivian Ashford. She was the individual who established the bakery, who taught me to laminate dough at the steel work table when I was young enough to require a step stool. She watched the accounting being performed on me for years and said very little. Vivian was not someone who spoke extensively. She was someone who maintained documentation. 6 years ago, as her health declined, she relocated to the flat upstairs above the shop so she could observe the ovens. That was her phrasing. She observed considerably more than the ovens. She passed 4 years ago in spring. Following the funeral, my father delivered remarks about legacy and the family name. My mother wept gracefully. Oliver posted a photograph of the awning. And then everyone returned to assuming the building simply belonged to them collectively. A joint family asset. Half my parents, half mine in some imprecise manner that could be debated whenever Oliver required funds. That presumption is the essence of this story. Remember it. Because the day following Vivian's funeral, I received a letter I disclosed to nobody. The letter came from a law office several towns away. Plain envelope. My name in precise handwriting on the front, Eleanor Ashford. Inside was a brief note from a solicitor named Gerald Whitfield requesting that I contact him at my convenience regarding a matter your grandmother established previously. I assumed it was sentimental, a keepsake, a savings bond, possibly the recipe book. I drove to his office the following week. Whitfield's office carried the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco. He was somewhere past 70. Methodical, deliberate. He'd been Vivian's solicitor for more than 30 years, since before I was born. "Your grandmother," he began, "did not trust easily, but she trusted with intention. There's a distinction." He opened a folder across his desk. Inside was a deed. I'd seen property documents. I didn't comprehend immediately what I was reading. Then I examined the name on the line designating the owner. It wasn't Ashford family. It wasn't my father Richard. It wasn't shared anything. It was a single name. Mine. Eleanor Vivian Ashford, sole proprietor. Recorded 6 years prior, 2 years before she even passed away. She transferred ownership to you while she was living, Whitfield stated quietly, a statutory transfer completely registered. She retained the legal right to occupy the flat above until her death, nothing more. Everything else, the land, the structure, the storefront, became yours the day she executed the paperwork. I remained absolutely still. Does my father know about this? Your grandmother was absolutely clear that he mustn't be informed. He interlaced his fingers. She wanted to observe how the family treated the building when they believed it was theirs to divide. She told me, and I documented this precisely. A person reveals their true nature when they think they're managing someone else's property. I asked him why. Why me? Why not distribute it equally? Why not simply leave it in a will in the conventional manner? Why maintain a secret deed years before it would matter? Whitfield removed his spectacles and wiped them with a cloth from his pocket. Slowly, the way elderly men purchase themselves time to select their phrasing. Because a will gets challenged, he responded. A will gets read in a room where the person with the loudest voice prevails. Your grandmother spent her lifetime observing the loudest person in your family win. He replaced his spectacles on his nose. A recorded deed isn't perspective. It's fact. She wanted to provide you with a fact, Eleanor. Something they couldn't persuade you to doubt with sentiment. And the 6 years before her passing, why did she do it so early? So that by the time it mattered, the question of whether she retained her mental capacity would already be resolved with documentation, established long before anyone considered questioning it. She told me your father would declare her mentally incompetent the day he discovered the truth. She wanted the record to be 6 years established by then. He almost smiled. She was an exceptionally meticulous woman. I constructed a great deal of her design across 3 decades, and she scrutinized every element. I held her in tremendous regard. I drove home that evening and told nobody. Not because I was developing a strategy, because I hadn't yet comprehended what I possessed. It would require 4 years and a manila folder under my father's arm before I did. For 4 years, I permitted the family to maintain their preferred narrative. I understand how that appears. People invariably ask me the identical question. How could you remain silent and allow them to discuss your building as if it belonged to them? The truthful response is that owning something on paper and genuinely feeling like you own anything within your own family are entirely separate experiences, and I possessed only one. So I continued opening at 4:40. I maintained the accounts. I observed. I watched my father reference the shop as our property at Christmas dinner. I watched my mother inform her bridge companions that the children would eventually divide it. I watched Oliver borrow against a future stake in a property he'd never legally possessed. And gradually, without consciously deciding to, I started maintaining documentation the way Vivian had. Not from malice, but from a sensation I couldn't yet describe. The sensation you experience when you're holding a card nobody else knows about, and the game keeps escalating. I scanned every receipt. I preserved every text where my father mentioned the building's operating hours. I filed the repair invoices under my own name. When Oliver requested that I co-sign something modest 2 years prior, I said I'd think about it. And then I quietly photographed the loan paperwork he'd abandoned on the counter. His obligations weren't modest. They carried commas. I want to be transparent about the loan application because it became the most significant element later, and I don't want you believing I was searching for it. Oliver came into the shop on a Tuesday 2 years ago. The variety of Tuesday where it's pouring rain and nobody ventures out and the hours stretch endlessly. He carried a folder. He wanted me to co-sign, just to strengthen the file he mentioned. Dad's already approved it. It's basically complete. He positioned the folder on the counter while he went to the lavatory. The way he deposited everything, assuming someone else would manage it. I didn't open it to examine it. I repositioned it so it wouldn't become damp by the sink, and it fell open, and I observed the figure at the bottom. I won't state the amount, but it was substantial. It represented a figure that would require someone a decade to recover from, and it was connected to no enterprise I'd ever heard him identify. I photographed it. I instructed myself it was so I'd understand what I was being requested to co-sign. When he returned, I said I'd think it over. I never signed. He never referenced the folder again, and I suspect he forgot I'd ever witnessed it. I retained the photograph for 2 years. I nearly destroyed it repeatedly. Something prevented me. The identical something my grandmother must have experienced. All those years maintaining documentation of a family that didn't realize they were being observed. I never planned to utilize any of it. I convinced myself I was simply being cautious. Then this spring, my father arranged a family meeting regarding a remortgage, and the manila folder surfaced. The Sunday of the meeting, I arrived early. My mother was arranging coffee. Oliver was in the lounge, distracted by his phone. My father was positioned at the head of the table with the loan papers arranged in front of him and that manila folder tucked beneath. "Sit," my father instructed. I complied. He proceeded methodically, like a man delivering judgment. The bakery was thriving. That presented a complication because it meant the property possessed equity. Oliver had financial commitments. A cash-out remortgage would leverage the property's value, settle Oliver's obligations, and preserve family reputation. And to accomplish that, my father continued, the lender requires every proprietor to sign. Your mother, myself, and you. There it was. He believed I was a partial proprietor. He had absolutely no idea I was the exclusive one. I want you to recognize how certain he was. He'd printed an outline. He'd arranged folders for each of us with our names on tabs, as if we were a governing committee he chaired. He'd already appointed the lender. He'd already, I would discover later, informed the loan officer that the property was a collective family asset held by 3 relatives, which explains why the paperwork arrived at the closing configured that way. He'd constructed the entire arrangement on a solitary assumption he'd never once verified. My mother distributed the coffee. Oliver reclined across from me with his arms crossed, the posture you adopt when the decision's already been made, and you're simply waiting for propriety to conclude. Read me the section, I said, about what happens if the payments stop. My father turned a page. There's no circumstance where the payments stop. Read it regardless. He didn't read it. He spoke over it, the way he consistently spoke over anything that might hinder him. That was the indicator. A man who's reviewed the fine print doesn't feel compelled to mask it. How much are we removing? I inquired. He specified a figure. It was considerable. Substantial enough that if the bakery experienced a difficult period, the property could become vulnerable. And if Oliver can't manage the payments, my father's jaw contracted. He will. But if he can't, I said, the building becomes security. We could forfeit it. We won't forfeit anything, my mother said, if you stopped manufacturing difficulties and signed. That's when my father spoke it. He shifted the papers toward me, smiling, and delivered the statement he'd apparently been preserving. A son carries the name Eleanor. You merely occupy the space beneath it. Oliver represents the family's trajectory. Your responsibility is to support him. Sign. The room became silent. Oliver finally looked up from his phone, displaying a small smile, anticipating that I'd capitulate like I invariably had. I took the pen. I capped it. I set it down. I'd like to review it first, I said. My father's expression tightened. There's nothing to examine. It's standard. Then it shouldn't trouble you if I do. I pushed the papers back across the table unsigned, and that was the instant, the quiet, unremarkable instant, when my mother's hand stopped moving across her coffee cup. And my father understood for the first time in 29 years that he genuinely didn't know what I would do. I brought the paperwork home to examine. That evening, I reviewed every page, and reading it, I comprehended what my grandmother had needed me to recognize 4 years too soon. The remortgage documents identified the proprietors as Richard Ashford, Margaret Ashford, and Eleanor Ashford. 3 equivalent parties. Someone had simply presumed. The lender had been advised the property was a collective family possession and had prepared the paperwork accordingly, requiring all 3 proprietors to execute as guarantors. But there was no joint deed. There was only Vivienne's recorded transfer deed, conveying the property to me exclusively 6 years prior. My parents had never held title. Not ever, not for a solitary day. which indicated they were attempting to remortgage a building they didn't possess by obtaining the genuine proprietor, me to authorize it as if I were merely one-third. I contacted Gerald Whitfield the subsequent morning. He listened, then paused for a moment. "Your grandmother," he said deliberately, "would have identified this as the test arriving. What do I do?" "Nothing ostentatious," he responded. "You permit the procedure to advance. A remortgage like this involves a closing. There's invariably a title search. A title company can't provide a policy without establishing authentic ownership. When they examine the documentation, the reality emerges naturally. You won't need to articulate anything. You'll simply require being in the room when they communicate it. And if I informed my father immediately, then he'd have weeks to reshape it, to label me dishonest, to coerce you privately." Whitfield's voice carried dryness. "Your grandmother invested 6 years establishing the table, Eleanor. Don't dismantle it before the guests sit." I recognize the wisdom. The disclosure had to happen where disagreement became impossible. In front of the lender. In the record. There's an additional element Whitfield mentioned before I disconnected. You'll need to be prepared for what follows. I've witnessed individuals triumph in the room and forfeit their family simultaneously. Occasionally that exchange is justified. But it's an exchange nonetheless. I want you to recognize the cost. I contemplated that for quite some time. The cost. I'd been paying that cost my entire life. I responded, "I'd simply appreciate receiving something in exchange." He was silent. "Then your grandmother expressed nearly identical words to me the day she executed the paperwork. 'I'll have the certified documentation prepared for you. Attend before the closing.' So I executed an action that 4 years prior I wouldn't have possessed the courage to complete. I contacted my father and communicated that I'd authorize at the closing. He was overjoyed. That portion still feels unusual to me. How delighted he became. 'I recognized you'd recognize sense,' he remarked. 'You're a sensible young woman fundamentally.' The closing was arranged for a Thursday morning in mid-June at the title company's office in the city. A glass-walled conference room on the 9th floor. The lender would dispatch a representative. The title company would supply a closing agent. My parents would participate, and because the loan benefited him, Oliver would too. In the 3 weeks preceding, the family extended affection toward me I hadn't experienced since childhood. My mother called asking about my week. Oliver transmitted a thumb symbol and the phrase "appreciate you, sis," which constituted more communication than he'd offered in a year. My father mentioned to a relative at a summer gathering that Eleanor ultimately comprehends family significance. I permitted it to unfold. I shouldn't pretend it didn't affect something inside me. That primitive optimism that this instant's support would produce love instead of simply being consumed. There was an occasion roughly 10 days preceding the closing that nearly destabilized me. My mother invited me to supper, just the two of us, she mentioned, which had never occurred in my adult existence. She prepared the beef and root vegetables she'd made during my childhood. The singular positive recollection I held of her. We sat at the kitchen table, and for nearly 60 minutes she became someone different. She asked regarding the shop. Genuinely asked. She chuckled at something I communicated. When I rose to depart, she embraced me at the entrance and sustained it an instant longer than customary. I drove home shaking because for a single hour I'd experienced the mother I'd yearned for my entire life. And I absolutely recognized, that the only explanation I possessed her was that they required my signature. The cruelest action my family perpetrated wasn't the detachment. It was presenting me 10 days before I'd lose them precisely the affection I'd always wanted, and permitting me to comprehend it had perpetually been obtainable. They'd simply never deemed me valuable enough to provide it until they needed something. I nearly withdrew. I remained in my automobile outside my flat with my mobile in my grasp, prepared to inform Whitfield I'd just authorize it. Grant Oliver the funds. Maintain the mother who prepared meals. Then I remembered the statement. A son carries the name. You merely occupy the space, and I recognized that the meal was the rent. A solitary warm supper in exchange for everything I'd earned. I placed the telephone down. The subsequent morning, I traveled to meet Gerald Whitfield, another instance. He distributed a certified reproduction of the deed, the recording verification evident at the top, and a solitary sealed envelope. "What is this?" "Your grandmother wrote it 6 years ago," he mentioned. "She requested that I deliver it to you on the day your family discovered the truth." "Not prior. I positioned it in my bag. I didn't open it." 3 days preceding the closing, I remained late at the shop after we'd secured the entrance, and I assembled the documentation. I distributed everything across the steel work table, the identical table where she'd instructed me. The certified deed, the county recording verification, 4 years of repair receipts, each one beneath my name, each one a minor undetected evidence that I'd been the legitimate proprietor in all meaningful respects, except in their conviction, the copies of my father's messages. Let's refresh the awning on our property. The shop is performing excellently this quarter. Our property tax is approaching. His own language repeatedly establishing that he'd believed the building was his, which rendered the she-manipulated an elderly woman narrative completely untenable. You cannot be deceived out of something you remained certain for 6 years that you already possessed. And the photograph of Oliver's loan application, 2 years old, the amount at the bottom that I'd never managed to forget. I arranged it the manner Whitfield arranged documentation, sequentially, numbered, so that if I ever needed to display it, each component would respond to the inquiry the preceding one generated. I wasn't confident I'd employ any of it. I informed myself repeatedly that I was simply being organized. I'm uncertain that was ever fully accurate. Oliver nearly discovered me. He would stop by. He'd taken to doing that now that he was being pleasant to me. Simply checking in. And I recognized his key in the front entrance. The original key my parents still maintained a duplicate of. I gathered the pages into the folder and slid it under the register drawer 2 seconds before he pushed through. "Working late," he mentioned. Consistently, I responded. He examined the shop, the dark ovens, the spotless steel table, with something I couldn't interpret. "It's an excellent establishment, Elle," he expressed almost tenderly. "You maintain it magnificently." For a moment, I believed he genuinely meant it. Then he continued, "It'll be beneficial to have it arranged. Following Thursday, settle everything." And I comprehended that arranged signified mortgaged, and that even his infrequent sincerity was merely the preliminary to the request. Thursday, I concurred and guided him to the exit and secured it behind him and returned to the folder. I positioned everything in an unadorned one. Manila, it seemed appropriate. The evening preceding the closing, Oliver transmitted a message. Not electronically, an actual call. "Hey," he said. "So, tomorrow, I mentioned." There was a pause, and momentarily I suspected he might actually articulate something genuine. "Listen, I recognize you handle considerable work with the shop. I simply wanted you to understand I perceive it. I positioned myself on my bed's edge, 11 years previous in my thoughts for an instant, yearning to accept that my brother had ultimately become someone who noticed me. Then why am I the individual providing guarantee on my portion so you can discharge your commitments?" I inquired. The pause this instance was distinct. Colder. "Because that's the mechanics, Elle. Dad's accurate. The shop carries the identity. You carry the shop." He produced a small sound that might have been laughter. "Don't overanalyze it. Just authorize and we're complete." And there it existed. The identical accounting. Articulated delicately this instance which somehow felt more harmful. I didn't object. I communicated farewell. I disconnected, and I remained in darkness for an extended period. And I permitted myself to comprehend the complete dimension of it. That even presently, the most generous action my brother could envision was acknowledging the assistance. I anticipated the injury would trigger recklessness. It didn't. It generated composure. I organized my clothing for the morning. Navy. The certified deed and my folder went into my bag alongside my grandmother's unopened correspondence. Subsequently, I rested more soundly than I had in years. The title company's office contained glass walls and gray carpet, the kind of environment constructed to render contracts feel inevitable. The conference room possessed an extended table and a perspective of the river. I arrived initially. I selected the position at the opposite end where I could observe the entrance. I'd come deliberately early. I required several moments alone in that room before it became crowded. I positioned my bag on the floor beside my seat. I positioned my palms flat on the temperature-controlled table, and I breathed. I contemplated my grandmother at the steel work table, flour coating her limbs, instructing me. I was approximately 10. That the mechanism for laminating dough involved perseverance. Chilled hands, she'd articulate. You accelerate it. The fat penetrates and deteriorates the structure. You anticipate. You integrate. You anticipate. The mechanism depended on resisting the compulsion to expedite. She wasn't discussing dough. I comprehend that presently. She'd been instructing me how to persevere 6 years before she'd recorded the deed. My parents appeared jointly. My father in his premium jacket, my mother in pearls, both performing comfort. Oliver entered behind them, spectacles positioned on his head, currently reviewing his telephone. There she is, my father articulated, pleasant for the observers, my dependable one. The lender's representative was an efficient woman holding a portable device. And the closing agent, the individual who would genuinely direct us through the documents and establish ownership, was a man named Michael Brandt. Mid-50s, spectacles suspended on a cord, the measured manner of someone who'd concluded 1,000 of these and had greater faith in the documentation than the occupants. He shook everyone's hand. He distributed the paperwork. He outlined the operation in a composed, courteous tone. He'd verify identities, examine the ownership details, detail the loan conditions, and gather signatures. Before we commence, Brandt mentioned, positioning his spectacles. Let me verify the ownership history so we're reviewing identical documentation. My father reclined, confident. He thought he recognized this component. He didn't. Brandt rotated to a page in his file, positioned his digit on the line, and hesitated. His eyebrows contracted subtly. He reviewed it once more. I'm regretful, he articulated, raising his gaze. I desire to guarantee I interpret this accurately before we advance. The room became completely silent. This ownership documentation has represented a solitary proprietor for the preceding 6 years, Brandt mentioned. Why does the loan documentation suggest 3 parties? For a moment, nothing altered. My father chuckled, the relaxed sound of a man convinced there'd been a documentation mistake. 3 proprietors, my consort, myself, and my progeny. It's a collective family property. Has remained for 30 years. Brandt examined his documentation. Mr. Ashford, the recorded transfer deed designates 1 proprietor. The property was conveyed in entirety 6 years previously to a singular individual. There's no collective holding on documentation. No conveyance to yourself or Mrs. Ashford. Never, in any circumstance. That's not feasible, my father mentioned. The laughter disappeared. We've possessed that property for, sir. I'm reviewing the governmental documentation. Brandt's voice maintained its impartial and patient quality. The title is uncontested, and it's retained by a singular identity. The lender's representative reclined nearer, her portable device forgotten. Whose identity? Brandt examined downward, subsequently upward, and his gaze located me at the opposite end of the table. Eleanor Vivian Ashford. The silence that followed was the most deafening phenomenon I have experienced. My mother's fingers moved to her jewels. Oliver's communication apparatus descended gradually, his face vacant like a screen that had darkened. I witnessed my father's expression accomplish something I'd never observed. For a moment prior to the irritation surfaced, there was absolute perplexity. The appearance of a man whose ground has shifted, reaching for an anchor that never existed. He examined Brandt, he examined the manuscript, he examined me, and I recognized in that instant that he genuinely hadn't understood. He hadn't been communicating false information regarding the property being his. He'd been accepting his own fabrication so completely that he'd started to accept it as reality. And the deed in Brandt's grasp wasn't merely stripping a property from him. It was removing the interpretation of himself he'd developed across 30 years. I should have experienced triumph. Mostly, I experienced exhaustion. My father rotated toward me, What precisely have you executed? Not an inquiry. An assertion. I didn't perform anything, I mentioned. My articulation was firm. I was astonished by how firm grandmother did. That constitutes falsehood, my father articulated. He repositioned his seat backward and rose, and the practiced courtesy had vanished, substituted by something unfiltered. My mother would never have displaced me. She experienced confusion. She experienced deterioration. Whatever you influenced her to endorse, she endorsed it 6 years previous, I mentioned. She wasn't experiencing confusion then. She wasn't experiencing deterioration. And she didn't communicate it to me till subsequent to her passing. You're communicating deception. I reached into my bag. I positioned the certified reproduction of the deed on the table and pushed it the dimension of the table, the manner he had pushed the financing papers toward me 3 weeks prior. Recording validation at the apex, I remarked. Governmental insignia. You're able to examine it yourself. Brandt extracted it prior to my father could. He examined it, nodded methodically. This corresponds with the ownership documentation. It's the registered instrument. My father retrieved it from him and examined it. I witnessed his gaze traverse the line where the proprietor's designation appears, and I witnessed the instant the property discontinued being his in his intellectual framework. The instant he recognized it had never been his whatsoever. This constitutes manipulation, he articulated. Yet his articulation fractured on the statement. She influenced an elderly individual. I was 23 when she executed it, I mentioned calmly. I didn't even understand it was present. You're able to petition her solicitor. He's prepared for you. His designation is Gerald Whitfield, and he retained documentation of every interaction he possessed with her that represented the initial stronger component of verification, and I witnessed it penetrate. Yet my father was an individual who, when he should have retreated, perpetually intensified, and he accomplished it presently in a chamber complete with observers, with the documentation displayed on the table. Right, he snapped. Right. The deed conveys what it conveys, yet she maintains obligation to this family. We raised her, we facilitated her survival. That property represents our inheritance, and she will endorse that loan or she is terminated from this family. I desire to characterize the chamber because the chamber constitutes the complete rationale my grandmother persisted. Brandt had developed profoundly composed and profoundly professional, the manner individuals become when a transaction has discontinued being a transaction. He'd witnessed families deteriorate across closings previously, I hypothesize. He maintained his grasp level on the file. He didn't divert his attention, and he didn't appear entertained. He appeared like an individual who would recollect this accurately if anyone ever inquired. The lender's representative, her designation was Miss Garrett. I recognized subsequently, when she distributed me her credentials departing, had terminated performing the pretense of documentation. She was observing my father the manner you observe an individual who has simply communicated, without comprehending that he is not an individual you desire involvement with in a contractual arrangement. And my mother hadn't shifted, not a solitary motion. She was examining the certified deed on the table as if it might adjust to a distinct identity if she concentrated sufficiently. The lender's representative shifted in her position. Mr. Ashford, Brandt articulated with care, your progeny is the sole proprietor. Nobody else is capable of pledging this property, and she would be pledging it not for her own interest, but to settle. He examined the financing documentation, a different individual's pre-existing commitments. I'm compelled to caution her plainly that she maintains no responsibility to accomplish that. None whatsoever. She maintains obligation to us, my father mentioned. And subsequently Oliver, who had remained silent, ultimately articulated, and he condemned himself with a solitary statement. Just authorize it, Eleanor. Oliver articulated, his intonation rising. You don't even require the funds. The shop is yours. Excellent. Acknowledgement. Yet I'm submerged below. I've obtained individuals I'm indebted to. Significant individuals. You hypothesize I'm able to suspend indefinitely? You're indebted to me. You've perpetually been indebted to me. I'm the progeny. The chamber developed silent in a contemporary manner. The lender's representative examined Oliver. "Individuals you're indebted to," she iterated. "What classification of commitments are we examining specifically?" "Because the loan application documented enterprise integration." Oliver recognized excessively tardy what he'd articulated. It's personal. It's pertinent," she articulated, "if we're being requested to fund it." I extracted my individual folder, subsequently the unadorned manila instance. "This is the component I desire you to contemplate for an instant prior to I communicate what was inside." The whole chamber had simply transformed. The lender had perceived the terminology submerged. My father had been communicated on the documentation that he maintained no entitlement to the property he'd constructed his existence upon. My mother was grasping her jewels, and the least complicated action globally, the activity the prior Eleanor would have accomplished, was to permit it to terminate there. The financing was already deceased. I'd already succeeded. If triumph was the terminology. What would you have accomplished? Extracted the folder or left it, enclosed and departed with integrity? Persist for an instant and choose because what I selected conveyed more regarding me than regarding them. I extracted the folder. Since we're confirming the documentation I articulated, this might clarify. I distributed the manuscript sequentially, the manner you dispense playing materials, the repair receipts for the property, all beneath my designation. Years of electronic communications where my father mentioned the property as ours, verification in his individual language that he'd recognized it as his, which rendered the she-manipulated an elderly individual narrative completely unworkable, because you don't receive manipulated out of something you remained convinced for 6 years that you already possessed, and Oliver's financing documentation from 2 years prior. The instance he'd deposited on my counter with the substantial calculation at the base. These constitute his genuine commitments, I articulated, not enterprise integration. He desired to acquire funding leveraging my property to settle them. And he desired my parents to coerce me into pledging it as a guarantor for a property I'm the exclusive proprietor of. I desired everyone in this chamber to comprehend what was fundamentally being requested of me. Oliver lunged for the financing documentation. I permitted him to acquire it. It was irrelevant. Everyone had already witnessed the calculation, and the lender's representative possessed a reproduction of his genuine documentation in her individual carrier. "You maintained this for 2 years," he articulated. His articulation had developed fragile. "You documented you were monitoring me. You positioned it on my counter," I articulated. "You perpetually position objects on my counter and anticipate someone else to handle them. I handled it." My father endeavored to reclaim the account. "This constitutes individual family circumstance. None of this is applicable in this chamber." Mr. Ashford, Brandt articulated without sentiment. "Your progeny just communicated to a governmental financing authority on the documentation that the articulated objective of the financing was untruthful. That doesn't belong amongst family. It belongs in documentation." The lender's representative examined the financing documentation. Her expression contracted like a barrier. She shifted her portable device back into her carrier. "I reckon she mentioned that this financing is not advancing presently." She examined Oliver, subsequently my father. "And given what's been communicated, I'll be documenting the application as rejected for misstatement. I'd recommend all participants to pursue individual consultation." Misstatement. The terminology descended on my father like a tire excessively dense to maintain. He'd invested his existence becoming the most respectable individual in every chamber. And in this chamber, the youngest expert at the table had simply utilized a terminology regarding his family that would accompany the designation he was so honored of, that should have constituted the conclusion. The financing was terminated. The reality was on documentation. Any reasonable individual would have reclined. My father didn't recline. He rotated on me, and the component that had existed beneath the attraction for 29 years ultimately demonstrated its complete appearance. "You're thankless." His articulation trembled. "Following everything. We delivered you that shop. We delivered you a position in this family. You represented nothing. You were the reserve, and the moment you obtain a manuscript, you condemn your individual relations to mortify me in front of visitors. I didn't mortify you, I articulated. I examined the manuscripts. Your grandmother perpetually cherished you most, he communicated harshly, and observe what it constructed you. A burglar in a Navy outfit. My mother articulated for the inaugural instance following the deed had surfaced. Calmly to me. Eleanor, don't perpetrate this against your brother. He's family. The shop's able to sustain this. Compassion. For the family. Mother, I articulated, are you comprehending what you're requesting? You're requesting me to mortgage the singular thing I possess, to discharge commitments I didn't generate for an individual who's never completed labor in a single instance, because he was delivered initially and possessed a surname. You've been requesting me some iteration of that throughout my existence. The singular component that's distinct presently is that for the initial instance I'm capable of communicating rejection and have it genuinely register. He's your sibling, she articulated repeatedly, with no assistance, as if the terminology represented a key that had perpetually operated. And I'm your progeny, I articulated. When was the preceding instance that signified you shielded me? She possessed no response. I witnessed her investigate for one and not discover it. And for the inaugural instance in my existence, I witnessed my mother comprehend that there might not be one. And there it was, the machinery completely displayed on a conference table on the 9th elevation. My father identifying me as a burglar for possessing what belonged to me. My mother requesting me to incinerate to maintain Oliver comfortable. My brother who communicated I was indebted to him an hour prior, presently examining his footwear. For 29 years I had completed that silence by facilitating myself to diminish. This instance I permitted it to persist. I permitted the lender to perceive it. I permitted the closing agent to perceive it. I permitted my parents to perceive themselves. Subsequently, I enclosed my folder. If you've ever possessed a family that designated your limitations as disloyalty, that addressed the instant you stopped yielding, as the instant you transformed into the antagonist, I contemplate you currently recognize what I experienced positioned in that seat. If this contacted you this evening, I desire it to contact the subsequent individual who requires it. I'm not pledging the property, I articulated. Not presently, not ever. Not to discharge commitments I didn't generate. Subsequently, you're not my progeny. My father articulated repeatedly, with increased volume as if intensity could make it authentic. That's been authentic for an extended period, I articulated. I merely implemented the accounting your approach. I rose. Brandt was currently compiling the financing manuscripts into a neat, deceased arrangement. The lender's representative was positioned to depart, anxious to vanish. My mother was weeping without expression. Oliver hadn't shifted. I extracted my certified deed and positioned it back into my bag, and my digits contacted Vivian's correspondence, still enclosed, the instance Whitfield had communicated to access on the instant my family recognized the reality. This was the instant I accessed it precisely there, positioned at the conclusion of the table whilst they observed. Her manuscript hadn't transformed. Small, regular, certain. Eleanor, it articulated. If you're examining this, they've oriented toward the property. And you've recognized what I perpetually hypothesized, that the singular individual who perpetually genuinely carried this family was the individual they designated the assistants. I didn't deliver you the shop to construct you prosperous. I delivered it to you because a deed constitutes the singular classification of devotion your father's incapable of influencing you to question. Don't permit them to lease you anymore. You weren't perpetually the replacement. You were the individual who manifested. Secure the entrance at evening and comprehend it's yours. Grandmother, I articulated it to myself. I didn't communicate it aloud. Certain components aren't for the chamber. Yet I examined upward when I finished, and I contemplate they recognized on my appearance precisely what it articulated. Don't ever designate the shop ours repeatedly, I instructed my father. It was hers, presently it's mine. You're able to move in and obtain a refreshment like anybody." I departed. Behind me, the glass entrance restricted on the most deafening silence of my existence. I obtained the ascending chamber, prior to my hands initiated trembling. Not from dread, from the extraordinary nature of possessing accomplished it. Of having positioned in a chamber whilst my father identified me as a burglar, and my mother requested me to combust, and of having remained positioned, maintained my intonation, and departed with the property and the reality simultaneously mine. In the reception space, Ms. Garrett, the lender's representative, achieved me. She distributed me her identification. "For what it's important," she articulated. "I've positioned through a considerable quantity of these. The majority of individuals in your position authorize. They authorize because the table makes them feel compelled." She examined toward the ascending chambers. "You didn't. That's uncommon compared to you'd hypothesize." Subsequently, she departed, and I remained positioned in the stone reception space of a structure I'd never inhabited previously, retaining the identification of a stranger who'd comprehended me more distinctly in 30 minutes than my family had in 29 years. I didn't move toward the shop instantaneously. I navigated toward the burial ground alternatively. I hadn't been present subsequent to the memorial service. I situated Vivienne's memorial, and I positioned myself on the vegetation in front of it in my Navy outfit, and I articulated what had occurred aloud. Every component of it. Like she was positioned at the steel work table listening. When I obtained to the component regarding her correspondence, I discontinued being able to articulate for a duration. That represented the secondary instance the management fractured. I permitted it. There was no individual present to distribute me that appearance. "You persisted 6 years," I ultimately articulated. "For me, so I'd possess a reality." I positioned my hand level against the refreshing rock, the manner I'd positioned it against the conference table. I persisted additionally, grandmother. I didn't accelerate it. I didn't permit the substance to penetrate. The atmosphere shifted the vegetation. That was everything, yet it constituted adequate. The consequences developed the manner these phenomena do. Calmly initially, subsequently abruptly. The financing never moved forward. The lender, having comprehended specifically what Oliver's commitments constituted, stopped thoroughly. Throughout a lunar period, a pair of the significant individuals Oliver was indebted to discontinued being affected. He required to liquidate his automobile and shift into my parents' residual chamber. The trajectory of the family rested in an individual mattress below a window. 33 years with nothing else to maintain apart from his personal designation. There extended a duration in those preliminary occasions where the telephone didn't cease. My father telephoned 17 instances the inaugural occasion. I didn't acknowledge. He transmitted communications that transitioned through everything he carried. Initially sensible, subsequently harmed, subsequently irritated. Subsequently near darkness, almost delicate, expressing that he experienced respect for my development, that we're able to remedy this, that family neglects. I examined that communication iteration. Subsequently, I obliterated it because I acknowledged it. It represented the intonation he applied directly prior to he required something. The gentleness represented an extraction. My mother transmitted documentation, genuine documentation, in her refined stationery because she understood I examined those when I existed more youthful and hypothesized I'd presently. The opening one mentioned I'd mortified the family in front of visitors. The secondary one, a pair of 40 periods, subsequently mentioned she didn't comprehend the location she'd made a miscalculation with me. Neither one of them utilized the terminology apologize. I maintain them in the compartment with my grandmother's correspondence, which constitutes its particular commentary on the distinction between the duo females. My father communicated to anybody who would perceive that I'd appropriated the family property. It operated for approximately 3 occasions. Subsequently, individuals initiated implementing the accounting the remainder of us had previously executed. that a lady isn't capable of appropriating a property that was legitimate, documented, distributed to her periods prior to somebody recognized. A familial member inquired him at a family gathering the reason his maternal relations solicitor held a carrier of commentary if it had all been a manipulation. My father discontinued obtaining invites to family gatherings. Auntie Loretta, my mother's sister, the singular individual in the family who'd perpetually compensated for her refreshment at the shop, contacted me. She didn't adopt a viewpoint specifically. She merely articulated, "Your grandmother mentioned to me that she'd confirmed you'd be satisfactory." I didn't comprehend the significance. I comprehend presently. She'd experienced pleasure with how it transpired. Subsequently, she requested if she was permitted to persevere going in on Saturday occasions for the orange buns, and I mentioned she was permitted to go in each occasion she selected, and she accomplishes. The closing agent, Michael Brandt, accomplished something else I didn't anticipate. Approximately a passage after, a container presented at the shop. Inside contained a momentary correspondence on identification certification heading and a spotless secondary reproduction of the documented deed authenticated in circumstance I ever required a replica. The correspondence articulated, "Eleanor, in 30 years I've witnessed an considerable amount of individuals authorize documentation they shouldn't because the chamber suggested they ought to. It constituted a privilege to perceive somebody not. Your grandmother selected accurately. Monsieur Brandt." I maintain that correspondence in the border, positioned behind the deed, a stranger's manuscript together with my grandmother's. The duo communicating me the comparable perspective she'd allocated 6 years attempting to guarantee I'd acknowledge. Oliver's commitments didn't disappear, obviously. Without my property to operate them via, he required to encounter them as they had been. He initiated liquidation procedures in the autumn. It was, by every record I obtained, mortifying and extended, and precisely the classification of effect my parents had allocated his lifetime acquiring him from. I didn't celebrate. I didn't distribute resources. For the inaugural instance, the accounting ultimately executed the manner accounting is hypothesized to. The individual who created the commitment was the individual who transported it. My mother communicated me singular occasion monthly subsequently. Not to apologize, to investigate if I'd reconsider facilitating Oliver presently that matters had settled. "Rejection," I articulated. "He's your relation." "He is," I acknowledged, "and the property is my own." Each of those is capable of being accurate. "Following everything this family transmitted to you, you transmitted me employment I wasn't recompensated sufficiently for, and a location at the table wherever I wasn't permitted to articulate. I articulated, grandmother transmitted me the property. Let's not intermix the duo." She continued to be quiet an extended duration. Subsequently, she articulated the component that I contemplate she'd been desirous to articulate subsequent to the conference chamber. "You were perpetually isolated, Eleanor. Even as a girl, you didn't require anybody. And there it existed, the discomfort designated by the individual who manufactured it. I distributed my existence, being communicated I didn't require affection by the individuals who guaranteed I never acquired any. So they'd not require sensation deteriorated regarding it. I required the entirety of you. I articulated every singular occasion. You merely determined it was economical to designate me isolated than to comprehend. She didn't communicate repeatedly for a duration. I substituted the fasteners on the shop, not from animosity, because Vivienne had instructed me to, in her methodology, secure the entrance at evening and comprehend it's yours. So I accomplished. I obtained a contemporary collection trimmed, and I maintained all of them. And that uncomplicated activity of maintaining my individual keys experienced like something I'd remained anticipating my existence to be permitted to accomplish. The occasion subsequently, I accomplished something I'd been hesitant to accomplish for 6 years. I progressed to the Municipal Documentation Center individually, and I obtained the deed, and I examined my individual designation on a community documentation in a community organization with visitors, approximately me, who maintained not viewpoint regarding whether I warranted it. It was merely a reality positioned in a compartment in a governmental workplace the manner Whitfield articulated it would be. I remained positioned there for a duration. Subsequently, I reimbursed for an authenticated reproduction of my individual, not because I wanted it, yet because I desired one that was my individual, and not the instance Whitfield delivered me. I maintain it positioned in the rear workplace, presently behind the workplace, wherever I'm capable of perceiving it when I'm implementing the payroll that utilize to experience like a task, and presently experiences like maintaining the lighting activated in a location that's my individual. It's currently late summer season. The vegetation is presently verdant. I repainted it individually this moment the manner she accomplished, and it required me 3 afternoons, and I didn't petition anybody for guidance. Ashford's is occupied. I recruited a pair of supplementary individuals. I transmitted the inaugural baker a compensation raise and days off since I'm conscious specifically what it expenses to be the individual who opens at 4:40 and perpetually acquires gratitude. I positioned my grandmother's photographic imagery adjacent the container, her at the steel work table, vegetation coating her appendages, not grinning for the cam, grinning at the dough. Regulars inquire who she constitutes. I communicate the lady who established this. They perpetually fail to inquire regarding my parents. To anybody who moves in from the exterior, this has perpetually remained my location and her location. There's a classification of correctness in that also. That the individuals who requested the designation on the partition with such intensity will never be the designation on the partition. I initiated implementing a singular component my grandmother never accomplished. On the inaugural Saturday of each lunar period, I direct a baking instruction in the rear for kids whose families are incapable of reimbursing for a session. The inaugural lunar period, a pair of kids participated. Current occasion, it constituted 9. Jammed approximately the steel work table she transmitted me at, obtaining vegetation everywhere, generating laughter excessively forcefully. Arthur, the elderly automobile motorist, provides assistance to facilitate rinsing the containers. Sarah, the overnight healthcare attendant, conveys her progeny. It constitutes the inaugural component I've ever produced that nobody's able to position a monetary claim on. My father and I don't maintain interaction. He progressed to the shop's singular instance in July, positioned at the container, and instructed for a refreshment without achieving my gaze. I manufactured it. I instructed him the compensation. He deposited £2 and didn't articulate gratitude, and mysteriously that constituted the most authentic interaction we'd maintained in years. He hasn't revisited. I obtain communications from Auntie Loretta that he's diminished presently, that the forcefully has departed from him, that minus the property to position himself upon. He's not quite certain who he constitutes. I don't commemorate it, yet I don't lay resting contemplating it additionally. An individual who distributes 30 years renting out his progeny shouldn't experience astonishment when she ultimately examines the arrangement. Oliver transmits occasionally. Momentary components. I'm expecting the shops performing. I communicate. Momentary components backwards. He obtained employment, a genuine instance, every hour at a storage facility at the perimeter of the municipality. Auntie Loretta mentions he's never expressed grievance regarding it, a solitary instance, which possibly constitutes the remaining fascinating component of this complete narrative. A pair of occasions passed. He transmitted something distinct. Not I'm expecting the shops performing. Merely I'm apologizing for the entirety of it. You don't require to communicate. I haven't communicated presently. I'm uncertain I'm going to, yet I haven't obliterated it additionally. Irrespective of whether that perpetually transforms into a relation, I'm uncertain. Certain entrances move gradually if they move in any way. I'm not maintaining the mechanism for him, yet I'm not constraining it additionally. Individuals inquire if I experience remorse. The closing, the folder, the deed positioned across the table. I don't. I experience remorse for the quartet of years I distributed maintaining a manuscript that currently articulated I belonged and experiencing like I didn't. My grandmother recognized something I had to comprehend the challenging approach. A family will articulate that affection constitutes something you gain by what extent of your consciousness you surrender. That a son maintains the designation and a progeny merely rents her location at the table. Yet a deed doesn't worry who they desired you to transform into. It simply documents what's genuine. My ownership designation states I'm the proprietor. I move through the entrance each occasion with my individual mechanism, and the component where it quantifies has maintained precisely one designation for 6 years. It constitutes my individual. It was perpetually going to constitute my individual.